think about your future self and like where you see that person being and blossoming. So if you want that person to grow, you're gonna have to be uncomfortable and be in uncomfortable spaces. And like the more you're uncomfortable and the more you push, the more you're gonna see like new doors open up.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Oh My Curry Goodness. My name is Hamza Islam, and on this podcast, I talk to some of the most interesting Gen Zers from different fields about their story and how they became the person they are today. One of the most common goals of this podcast is whenever I get a chance to talk to people, I want to get the most authentic, vulnerable, and honest version of them. Because when it comes to inspiration, we have to be honest because there's always someone that can benefit from those stories. And so I hope that I can get my guests to be just seen as human beings and focus on what they are rather than who they are. Because every human being has unique stories that can inspire someone, regardless of what they're pursuing. And I just want to continue to talk to amazing Gen Zers each and every week because we want to be known as the generation that inspires people, whether that's above us or older than us, younger than us, or just other Gen Zers. So I hope you guys continue to support this podcast in the future. Now, my guest this week is Fatimata Cham, who uses poetry and activism to talk about issues such as environmental justice, gender inequality, racism, Islamophobia, and other issues she is passionate about. In 2022, Fatimata landed on an Apple TV show known as Dear, a docuseries that features celebrities reading letters by people whose lives have changed throughout their work. And Fatimata chose to write a letter to Malala because she felt represented as a fellow Muslim and got to thank Malala for inspiring her to make a difference in her own city and hopefully inspiring others along the way. I'm very excited to be able to connect with a fellow Muslim, and so it's gonna be great to be able to talk about what her poetry means, activism, and so much more. So, Fatimata, thank you so much for joining Oh My Cray Goodness.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course, thank you so much for being able to join this podcast. You were someone who I was wanted to have, just because of the poetry aspect, the activism aspect, and more importantly, the religion aspect. And before we talk about poetry, I do want to talk about activism because one of the most common questions I've been asking lately is when it comes to representation, one of the things I'm curious about is how much pressure they put on themselves to be showing people like the best version of themselves. So when it comes to, racism, Islamophobia, the things that you have experienced in your life, I would love to know what kind of pressure you put on yourself as a Muslim woman. Like, is there any sort of pressure you put on, or do you feel like you're just trying to focus on how to be the best version of yourself and not trying to, I guess, prove a point to anyone?
I'm gonna think about that. That's a really good question. I think it's a combination of both. I think growing up, at least when I was in my middle school years and high school years, when I was starting in the activism space or just in general trying to be representative of my community, social media can be a very toxic place where you constantly feel the pressure in order for you to like prove that you're an activist or prove that you're showing up for your community, because a lot of times people see the successes, they see like, oh my gosh, she won this scholarship, she won this award. um Sorry, I should have turned that off. She won that scholarship, she won that award, but what is she actually doing in her community? So you find that a lot of people fall into this like habit of constantly posting and feeling pressure to prove themselves. So yeah, I think early on I did feel that pressure, but I think as I got older, it became more so like showing up for myself instead.
As someone who's involved in activism, I do want to ask you, and I think I may have talked about this topic with a couple of my guests in the past, but what is your biggest fear?
Ooh.
And I know that for a lot of, I mean, I know like as someone who's experienced it, I don't want to say you're used to it. I don't want to make it sound like it's a good thing, but it's like because you've experienced it so much, it's almost like you can't really stop me from what I'm doing. But I do want to ask you, as someone who is involved in this space and also uses poetry as well,
Yeah.
what are some of your biggest fears?
Mm, that's really good too. Um, I think I personally speaking, I have this fear of disappointing the said community that I'm representing or showing up for in these spaces. I think people have a lot of preconceived notions about like what a Muslim woman is supposed to be, and especially with my background, I'm Senegalese as well. So there are a lot of cultural factors of like how I'm supposed to behave. And I feel like sometimes I mean, I don't really care what people think, but I tend to fall outside of some of those norms. So I think there is that fear of disappointing said community and not properly representing that. I also have the fear, not that I'm scared of administration, but like I think oftentimes institutions can be a lot of scary, can be very scary. And I think being in college is very fear inducing, being in those rooms with like I mean having meetings with the president of the school and having meetings with the VP of student life, talking about like poverty on campus and food insecurity, and that it was very fear inducing as well. So I think those would be my two biggest fears.
I often think so. I mean, obviously, when there are people who don't look like you, they will obviously say mean things. But I think one of the most, and I think you touched on this, when it comes to cultural situations, like that is a huge fear because it's like, what? Wait, we've never seen anyone like you. What on earth are you doing? Like, why? We've never seen this. So that is definitely a fear. And I'll tell you this, I mean, in South Asian cultures, I think like definitely when you're in like the liberal art space or the poetry space, it's like, okay, I want to pursue this. And they're like, what are you, why?
Yeah.
We've never seen anything like this. So it's weird. Like I often feel like you can pursue your why, but I do want to ask you, like, when you see the doubts or the hatred or whatever that may be, is there a part of you where you're like, I don't necessarily think it's them being hateful towards me. It might be more because they just don't understand what I'm doing, and I feel like we need to like we might need to talk a bit. Like, do you ever feel like you're trying to be putting yourself in their shoes and trying to see like kind of like where they're coming from, even if some of the things they say are hurtful to you?
Oh yeah, for sure. I think I've always like my dad has always taught me to approach things with grace, and I feel like that in our society, people or cancel culture, people are so quick to like be judgmental about things and not really try and put themselves in other people's shoes. And I've always tried to cross the aisle or like understand or listen to other people and hear where they're coming from. I also think part of it too is like I'm also my parents are from a different country and I was born here. So like there is that huge gap or difference that I have to acknowledge and be willing to like understand and listen to people within my community who may not be used to like an outspoken like individual.
I want to talk about poetry now because, well, sort of. I want to start this in this way.
Yeah.
One of the most, I mean, I think you and I can both agree that there are always things like the littlest of things can mean so much to us. And so, for example, choosing something that you're passionate about can play a huge part in the future. And so, when I was getting ready for this conversation, I saw that poetry was not something you were passionate about. It was just something that you came across, and because it was about mental health, people loved it so much that this was something you wanted to pursue. I want to play the what if game in the sense where if you didn't do poetry, what were some of the things that you were passionate about that you could have pursued instead of pursuing that poetry route?
Ooh, that's um honestly, on the complete end of that spectrum. So when I discovered poetry, I think I was like 12 or 11, sometime in middle school. And around that time, I was also really, really deeply interested in STEM and science. And so I feel like on the opposite side of like the arts, I probably could see myself pursuing a career in like research and STEM more. And specifically, I was very interested, I remember, in like the environment. So environmental science. I did a lot of work with my eighth grade science teacher like after school. And I was really passionate about that. Kind of lost that passion when I got to high school because I don't know. It was just not something I saw myself doing on later. So I would say like on the complete opposite side of that, probably pursue something in science.
Yeah, I would say it's funny. So I actually am a computer science major, and so I would say that there are certain aspects I love about coding, and there's certain aspects I don't love about coding. When it came to podcasting, so I've done this for 4 years, but I started this particular podcast since January, and it was because of the pandemic where it I started having an interest in podcasting because it was a way of connecting with people and talking to them and just kind of sharing their story. So it's interesting how like how an event can just shape or just kind of like steer you into a different direction. And I want to say this because in case someone's like, so are you? So like in case there's like one South Asian parent that's like, "Oh, you're not going to pursue computer science." Like, no, I will pursue computer science. I love coding and I love building websites, but I think it's also okay to be able to find passion for more than one thing, right? Because like you talked about how you're using poetry and activism speaking about issues such as environmental justice, and you talked about like how before poetry you're involved in the environment aspect. So it's really important to realize that like the little things can mean so much into the future. And yeah, I don't know if you want to add more to that. Just it's interesting because it's like just because we pursue one thing, it doesn't mean we're like all in. There are other avenues that we find interest in, and it's just a matter
Yeah.
of how we want to pursue that in the future.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that has a lot to do with like our education system and like just how they cultivate us and teach us that like once you major in something, you got to stick to it and like spend the rest of your life doing it, but and no time for like side hobbies or other passions. So I feel like a lot of I feel like a lot of us are kind of like groomed to think that way. So it definitely takes a lot to step outside of that.
For sure. And also, if anyone heard that, I apologize. I accidentally dropped my phone, so I'm okay. But I want to talk about here's the thing about poetry, and in a way it's similar to podcasting in the sense where one of the things that I want to do is really connect with the guest or connect with the audience. And I don't know if this is something you relate to because it's hard because unless you don't have these personal conversations, we will never know. But a lot of the things that people do are much easier said than done. And so when it comes to poetry, I do want to know what's the relationship you have with art or with poetry. Like, is it quote unquote easy? How do you handle the overthinking aspect? If you've ever been involved in that space, like how would you describe the relationship you have with poetry and even today?
That's a good question. I think my relationship with poetry has definitely been up and down throughout the years. I think because I'm the type of poet that writes based on feeling or emotions, and I've always been that way. And so if I'm like not feeling something, it's harder for me to like sit down and like write poetry. And so oftentimes like I'll have like an event and they'll be like, oh, we want you to perform a poem, a new one. And I'm like, well, I can't like think of anything to write right now. So I think it's definitely been up and down. I've always been like a feeling emotion based type person. So most of my poetry like touches on that, I would say. Um, and I don't know, it's also been a source of healing for me over the years as well. Like personally, there is a lot of poetry that I've never shared with anyone and never made public. And that's because it's kind of like my thing and something that I keep to myself. So it's a mixture of both. Yeah.
Yeah, for I want to ask you though, like, how do you handle overthinking? Because here's the thing, and you mentioned you make a really interesting point, which is you connect with emotion, and you want to make sure that whenever you're presenting your poetry or your work, that you want the audience to feel something. So and sometimes it's like because you focus on the connectivity, it's very hard to just be like in the moment trying to just be the best version of you. So have you had moments like that, and tell me how you try to deal with that aspect? Because I think with podcasting, like similar to me, like I will constantly think so much to the point where I almost forget what I was thinking. I'll be like, okay, this wait, why did I think this way? And so now I'm like in a million places at once. So tell me about the overthinking aspect.
Yeah. Yeah, it's difficult. Like I think one specific example that comes to mind was I had an event with the Brookings Institute and they had asked me to write a poem that like inspires the next generation and like about hope or something. And they gave me a week to write it. And I was going back and forth with my sister, and like I would write something, she'd be like, this is horrible. And I'm like, this, she was like, this is not getting the message across, is not getting the point across. And so it can be stressful at times to like overthink. And I think the best pieces of poetry are the ones where you just like write. Like, so I think getting over that slump is just not thinking so much always about how it's going to be perceived. Yeah, that's the best thing I can come up with right now.
For sure. I would say, yeah, and here's the thing, like when it comes to podcasting, I always like I think the one thing that helps me forget about the overthinking aspect is just to really try and not think about overthinking, which I know sounds weird, but it's like, whenever I get ready for a conversation, I'm thinking about what are some of the things I can say, what are some things I don't want to talk about, and I'm just thinking to myself, why am I thinking about this? Let's just focus in the present and try to enjoy the conversation. And here's something, and one of the things that when I came to my podcast journey is that oftentimes when I first started this, I felt like I try to make a point to people, because when people don't know you, they'll go, "Who are you? Like, show me what you got," kind of thing. And then over time, I realized I want to have a balance between trying to make a point with someone, like that this podcast, that this message is useful, but also at the same time learn something from the person and see what they have to say, understand their perspective. As a poet, obviously you're meeting people who want to know what you have to say. Is there a part of you that has to balance the I'm actually curious about this, but like if you have to balance sometimes like trying to make a point with someone, or do you feel like you're just trying to be yourself and just tell people your perspective? Like, are you someone that's going into the storytelling phase, almost like how like it's like you're reading a book to it, like a group of children, and you're not expecting anything, you just hope they enjoy the story? Or do you feel like you're like, I'm here to show people that I belong in the space, if that makes sense?
No, that's a really good question. I think for me, it has always depended on like my audience. And I think typically in cases where like I perform my poetry in front of like my peers or like students, it's always like chill. Like I don't really care, and I find myself feeling more free doing that. But when it's like more formal events, it is definitely uncomfortable, and like you feel people judging you, like, is she actually a poet? Like, does she only do spoken word? Or like she does only like free verse writing? Like she do structured poetry? So it's definitely like a mixture of both. And I find that with maybe more with like adults, it can be a bit more intimidating. And I feel like I need to like prove myself as a poet, and like even to other poets as well. Like everyone has different writing styles. So some poetry may be better than others, or people feel like it's better than others. So that can also be a bit intimidating as well.
What kind of audience, you kind of mentioned this because you said adults, but is there like a group of people that you've spoken or you recite your poetry in front of, and every time you try to speak to them, or maybe it was just one experience, you were just like really really scared or nervous? Like, have you, like, is there a that you're thinking of at the moment, or is it just like it just kind of depends on like the moment?
No, yeah, there is a group that I was thinking of in the moment. I think it was like a UN event actually, and I was very nervous, and I like didn't know anyone in the room, honestly. So it was, yeah, it was very nerve-wracking, and I was like thinking to myself, like, do they even understand like the message that I'm trying to get across? Like, is this a waste of time? So yeah, that's like what I was thinking of when I was thinking of like adults and like institutions.
For sure. Here's here's the thing about me. So I love public speaking. So like, and if I was in a class and you told me to give a presentation, I would be like, okay, let's do it. But one of my fears, and it doesn't matter who I'm presenting with, whether it's someone who looks like me, someone who doesn't, adults, kids, people my age, whatever that may be, the thing I'm always worried about is just making sure that my message is good. And
Yeah.
so, for example, this is a bad example, but it's still an example that was really important to me. So we talked about the Islamophobia part, and so I took a class called Persuasive Communication, and we had a end of the semester project where we talked about an issue we were passionate about. So I chose Islamophobia because I was in the discrimination group and I was Muslim. So I thought, okay, let's talk about Islamophobia because I thought it would be easier. And the only my only fear was that my audience, no one else was Muslim. So I had a huge challenge to make sure that I connected with the audience as much as possible, because when you're talking to someone who looks like you, it's much easier. When you're talking to someone who doesn't look like you, then it's a really difficult challenge. So I had to focus on, one, can I get them to care about what I say? And then secondly, how can I make sure that what I say is really important? And it's not just like, okay, yeah, let's support it because it's an issue that needs to be talked about. It's okay, I'm interested in helping whatever that may be. So the connectivity part, the connection part, saying that if you make sense according to other people is definitely a challenge.
Yeah, sure.
So I want to talk about, as an activist and as a poet, and I think for a lot of young people in general, one of the common, or I mean, just anyone in general, one of the common things we fall into is road bumps along the way. And so no road is smooth for anybody. And I do want to talk about, and I don't want to focus too, like, I don't want to focus on like the dark aspect, but I do want to talk about the moments where you almost questioned yourself, or you just kind of like almost, I guess, gave up and we never get to see this version of you. Tell me a bit about the moments where you kind of felt like you were giving up, you were questioning yourself, because especially when you're first starting out, I think those first 6, 7 months when you're first starting, those are the hardest. That's the hardest period of time because no one knows who you are, and the moment you make a mistake, then there's like this devilish version of you that's like, see, you should have never been in this in the first place. So I want to know, and if you're comfortable, I do want to know more about like those moments where you questioned yourself and thought about giving up.
Oh yeah, definitely. I think there's plenty of those moments, but I think the key ones that come to mind, one would be probably my sophomore year of college. I was starting out with this coalition called Dear Lafayette, and it was in the wake of like everything that was happening in the country with BLM and George Floyd and all that stuff. And we were starting a coalition to demand our institution to better, basically. So provide more trainings for faculty, fund student activities, et cetera, et cetera. So we like released a list of demands. And I was stuck at home and having to sit on like useless Zoom calls with administration talking about like change and like what that looks like on our campus. And so that was a moment that I wanted to like give up, or like a struggle that I felt, because I was kind of like, this is pointless. Like we're talking in circles and nothing's getting done. And ultimately, being the youngest person within the coalition was also like, I'm just starting out my college experience, and this is like what I'm having to deal with, like be the spokesperson for like the Black community on campus, unfortunately. So that was definitely one moment that comes to mind. Another moment that comes to mind was, I think I've talked about this a bit before, but in high school, I was at like a protest with my friends, and like there was this man who had, supposedly he had dementia or some type of sickness, and he like just was saying a lot of racial and Islamophobic slurs to me and my friends. And so that was a very taxing moment for me in particular in my activism journey, because it was just like, I don't really want to do this anymore. Like, is it worth dealing with these individuals who like have no, in my opinion, no conscience or like empathy for the people? So that was also another moment where I struggled with like my journey and constantly feeling like I have to show up for other people, but no one's showing up for me. Because in that moment, like instead of consoling me, they were kind of like, oh, he has a dementia sickness. You can kind of just ignore it. So it's just stuff like that tends to be hard, I guess, within the activism space, especially when you're like from a marginalized community. You kind of feel like a lone wolf trying to advocate and like show for everybody else while you're slowly draining mentally and physically. So yeah.
I won't relate to you in the racism or the Islamophobic part, so I will never imagine what you had gone through. But that's what I when you see it, I think it's almost like it's very easier said than done when you're involved in activism, where it's like I'm going to fight for this group of people,
Right.
people who look like me. But then once you see these things, and I mean, obviously, like I don't know, I mean, not everyone's perfect, and everyone's got issues. But when you are seeing like those slurs or those things that are thrown at you, then you are in this very scary space. Whether it be activism or poetry, even though you're going through that rough period of time or rough periods of times, or what allows you to, when you fall down, what allows you to get back up?
I would definitely say like a lot of the friendships that I have allowed me to keep going, and like definitely the support of like my family and stuff has allowed me to keep going, because I feel like when you constantly have that positivity around you and like people cheering you on constantly, like you feel like motivated to get back up again. There are a lot of upperclassmen that I had built relationships with on my campus that like were super helpful in building the coalition, but also just like constantly checking in on me all the time, even when I didn't want to talk to anyone. So yeah, that's what I guess helped me.
For sure, I think having a community is so important, it's like even if there are thousands of enemies, at least, I mean, as long as you have someone with you, or as long as you have a group of people
Right.
that are willing to stand by you, I think it makes a situation better. Obviously, there's still a lot of injustice in the world, and there's still a lot of bad things happening to marginalized communities. But when you are able to stick together and just I don't want to say like help, or I mean, I guess we can say help each other, and know that we're all in this together. No one's alone. It does make the journey, the fight easier, even though it's difficult. So I think it's always really important to have a community of people, regardless if they look like you or don't look like you, to be able to join in the fight. And I think for you, like for me, I don't know if this is something you relate to, but like whenever there's someone with me, it makes me feel like I'm doing something right. Because sometimes there's moments where you're like, maybe I think I'm doing something right, but if I'm the only one standing up for this, then maybe it's not an issue. So I don't know if that's something you feel fine with, but like usually with me, and it doesn't matter if it's like fighting for the right thing, or if it's like maybe I see something wrong and I'm like, am I the only one? Like as long as someone else recognizes it, then it's like I think I'm doing the right thing. You know, like you get what I mean?
No, for sure. I definitely get what you mean. Like, I think that's how I built most of my friendships, is like them being in the same room as me, or just like I look at them, they look at me, and they kind of just know. So, yeah, I can definitely relate to that.
You are someone who has said in the past that finding one's journey is going to be uncomfortable. And I think that's what makes the journey special, is that there are moments where you're going to be uncomfortable, but you're going to come out of that experience stronger than before the experience, if that makes sense. So I would love to know, like, what are some of the examples you've had that has been you where you've had moments where you're like, oh, I'm in a very uncomfortable situation, but because of that uncomfortable situation, you were able to become a better person after that experience.
Oh, yeah, there's like tons of examples. I think the first one that comes to mind is I'm originally from New York City, but I've like been literally everywhere across the country. In my younger years, I went to a boarding school for 4 years from 13 to like age 18. And that boarding school was predominantly white. It was in northern New Hampshire in the middle of nowhere. And I met international students from all across the world, and had people who've never met a Muslim person before, and I've never met someone from Japan before. And that was definitely a moment of uncomfortability for me, because I'd never met any of those people from different backgrounds before. I was away from home, and I like didn't have anyone around me to console me. And through that experience, like graduating from boarding school and graduating from high school, I guess I came out of it pretty intact. So through that experience, I would say it definitely pushed me to try and understand people from diverse perspectives and diverse experiences. I've taken classes and went on trips with those people. So Yeah, I've definitely been like a cup in a bunch of spaces where it was uncomfortable and I had to like push through.
One of the most common things I've seen in like whether TV or just anywhere is being comfortable with being uncomfortable.
Uh-huh.
Because you can't just be comfortable and expect everything to be all easy. There are always going to be difficult things. And you talked about the experience, some of the experiences you had. There are a lot of people who may not have that same journey, same exact road that you took. So for other people, well, when it comes to other people, what advice would you give to them when it comes to the idea of being uncomfortable? Because sometimes the moment they see that, they go, "Oh no, I'm not doing that because that's
Yeah.
too scary. I'd rather be safe." So how do you try to convince other people, regardless if it's our generation, maybe younger generation or older generations, to be okay with being uncomfortable and realizing that it's actually a good thing and not the worst thing, even though it looks like it's a bad thing.
Oh yeah, for sure. I think my advice to that would be uh it's the best way for you to grow. Like, you don't want to remain stagnant, and you're not going to be able to become the best version of yourself if you stay in the same place around the same people. You're not going to be able to, I guess, have access to new opportunities if you stick to being comfortable. So, like, I guess my advice to that is just think about your future self and like where you see that person being and blossoming. So if you want that person to grow, you're gonna have to be uncomfortable and be in uncomfortable spaces. And like the more you're uncomfortable and the more you push, the more you're gonna see like new doors open up. Yeah. So that would be my advice to that.
Yeah, and here and the funny thing about this, so there was a part of me that was laughing because as you were saying this, I realized there's one word that comes to mind when it comes to the word uncomfortable, another
Yeah.
word, which is mistakes.
Yeah.
And so I think that's what I think holds us back is because we live in this this idea of like we need everything to be perfect. Sometimes I'll see like memes about South Asian cultures where it's like, oh, it's 100%. They need to get 100%. If they got 99% right, then they got 1% wrong. That's a bad thing. And so you bring up a really interesting point though, which is that what would your future self tell you? And being uncomfortable will allow you to grow. I kind of talked about this, I asked you this, and I do want to bring the question up again, but I want to rephrase it a bit. When you talked about the relationship you have with overthinking and art and talking about giving up, how do you handle like when you're making a mistake, whether that's something you realize later on or in the moment? Like, have you been helping? Have you allowed yourself to grow? Or and it's very easy to practice. It's very easy to say the things you do rather than experience it because it's very easy to go like, oh, it's okay for you to grow, but then if you're doing poetry and you mess up one word, you're like, oh no, I'm terrible. So when it comes to mistakes, like how do you handle that? Like how do you try to give yourself grace and realize that even if you make mistakes, that you're going to be okay and not to be too critical on yourself?
Yeah, that's thanks for pointing that out. I've never been the best at that, honestly speaking. Like I've always been like hyper critical type A. Like if I make a mistake or like I feel like I disappoint my parents or don't do well in something, I like get all in my head about it and get all emotional. And like it takes me like, I'm not gonna lie, it takes me a day or two or a week to kind of get over that. And then eventually I think back and I reflect, oh, it wasn't as bad as I thought it was. Like there have been a lot of experiences. I remember my freshman year in college, and someone had asked me to do a poetry performance, and it was my very first time. And I remember after that performance, like the whole entire night, I was just rolling, thinking, like, oh my God, like, how did I look up there? Like, what did I say? Like, what were people thinking? Like, oh my God, there was silence. Like, does that mean it was bad? Like, I don't know. I've always been like very hypercritical. And I think, like you said, granting yourself grace, but I also think granting yourself like time and patience to kind of process it. I feel like everything is just so fast paced in our world where it's just like, okay, you did this one thing, you checked off the box, like move on to the next. But what I've learned over the years is kind of just giving myself the time to process and being okay with that has definitely helped me uh grow in that sense.
It's okay. I am in the same boat as you where I struggle with this a lot. So I find I am very, very hard on myself. And so when it comes to giving presentations or giving pod or doing podcasts, if I stutter one time, then I'm like, this is the worst episode I have had the worst podcast performance ever. I am so bad at what I do. And here's where I would say I think being hard on yourself is a good thing because you know that you want to be, I don't want to say the best because I mean, I know you're someone who wants to make an impact. So I don't think as an activist, you want to be the best activist in the world, but you want to be an impactful activist. And so for me, it's like, I want my podcast to be impactful. And so because of how hard you are, like how hard you can be on yourself, it's like, it's because you care so much. And
Mhm.
obviously there are going to be people that will take it the wrong way where even though you have experience, there's always someone that's like, oh, you're terrible at what you do. And then it's like, all right, let me see you do it. And then it's like, so poetry. Yeah, it's a great, interesting field or interesting thing to be a part of. So what I've learned with mistakes, I used to be afraid of it and still do to this day. But what helps me is knowing that I still have a vision. I still have a plan. I have a platform as far, or not necessarily a platform, but I have a map of, or not a map. I guess what I'm trying to say is I know what I want to do. I know where my heart is in the right place. Sometimes at the heat of the moment, I make mistakes, but I'm still going to continue to try to be the best because at some point I will be at a stage where I won't be able to make that mistake. And if I do, it's okay. Try to not make that same mistake again. And obviously that's hard again, but you know, there's always going to be people that will take it the wrong way, but they don't know who you are. They're not part of the process. They just see, oh, well, we see poet activists, but we don't see Fatimata. We don't know who you really are. And so that's what I always respect. Like I don't want to be too critical about a person because I know they have a journey. And if I find that if I try to be the hater or the doubt or whatever, I'm gonna be proven wrong. And so I want to be in that stage where I go, you know what? Regardless if they did good or bad, I see them doing great things and I know it's for them it's just a journey.
I like that perspective.
I before I let you go, I do want to talk about I mean, well, there's a couple of things. First of all, you are someone who, as we mentioned, poetry and activism, but you also want to pursue a career in public office, and it's really cool to be able to connect with people who have those aspirations because if there's one thing that many people, I mean, I know this is obviously a no dip Sherlock kind of thing, but sometimes it's very hard in the country we live in today to find people who have a heart, particularly politicians. But the fact that you want to improve your communities, you want to improve marginalized communities, and so I'd love for you. I'm curious to know like what kind of positions you have in mind when it comes to public office. Are you thinking more of local politics, state politics, or do you see yourself going in the national level? I know obviously there's plenty of time for that, but nevertheless, like what are some of the positions you hope to I guess achieve as someone who wants to pursue a career in public office?
Yeah, for sure. That's a really good question. When I was younger, all my life, I always told my parents that I wanted to be mayor of my city. So, because that's always been like, I guess, watching TV, like all the big decisions that were impacting my city, I always saw the mayor doing that. So, sometime in the future, that's like my ultimate goal is to run for mayor of my city. I'm definitely interested in local politics. Like, I've interned on like district campaigns and things like that. So maybe running for city council or something like that in the future as well. And then in terms of like Capitol Hill, I would say I wouldn't go as far as like Secretary of Education or something like that because I still want to work with the communities that I talk about all the time. So yeah, I wouldn't go as far as that in terms of running for public office.
For sure. Okay, I'll when as you were saying this, one of the things that I remember, so when I was maybe 14 or 15, I wanted to become president of the United States. And so I was like 2048, I'm announcing my run. Like that's when I want to run. Like that's the year I want to win the election. And then a week later, I decided to drop out. I was like, I'm not doing this. But, but nevertheless, local politics is really important, and it's interesting because I've interviewed a couple of local politicians in the past, and some of the things they've talked about is the importance of local politics because these are the things that can make changes in their communities. National politics or national policies are important, but if we're talking about New York City, if we're talking about Columbus, Ohio, where I'm from, or just any city in general, you have to listen to your local politicians, or you have to make sure that you get them on board with you because those are the changes that, or those changes will come. I don't want to say quickly, but like they're gonna. I mean, they're the ones where it's like you need to make sure that you interact or they agree with you because some people can't wait longer. I don't know if that made sense, but like what someone I don't know who it was, but it's like sometimes national policies take a while to form and ultimately implement, but local politics because it's like close to you, that means those decisions will come quicker, and the more quickly you get things done, the better change, the more change you can make for your communities, and hopefully those changes are good and not bad.
Yeah, no, for sure. I feel like local politics is very underrated. A lot of people don't go out to vote as much as they should because it's like everyone's like, oh my God, the presidential election, cool, whatever. I don't really care who's in office because, like, at the end of the day, like, the substantial change that needs to happen isn't going to happen based on who's in office on Capitol Hill. It's based on like who's in your local community and those seats, like deciding the budget, deciding like what county, what borough gets the most money. So yeah, yeah, I think you're totally spot on with that.
The last thing I want to talk about is kind of just you as a whole in general. When it comes to activism, there's always something to improve in the future. And
Mhm.
so, back when the civil rights era happened, people wanted, I mean, these people fought for the right to vote, and they wanted future generations to be able to have that without any issue compared to how they grew up. And even though we still see some of these issues at play, nevertheless, one of the things that's really interesting about activism and that's really cool about you is that you want to continue to inspire people and realize that we can create things that can be important now and in the future. As someone involved in activism, especially for your community, what are some of the things that you would want them to have in the future that you were not able to have growing up? And here's the thing, when I was thinking about this, I was actually hesitant to ask you this question because sometimes it's like there's a sense of guilt, or like because I they were able to have something that I didn't have, there's almost a sense of like sometimes people wrestle with like am I truly happy for them because like they get to have it whereas I don't. So a common question is, when immigrants come to the United States, with their kids, they want their kids to have a better life than what they have. And so like my parents goal is to make me successful in whatever that may be. But then I'm also sometimes wondering, like, for other people, when they say I want to do something for these group of people, I don't want to make sure they get to have this that I didn't have. Sometimes it's like there's like this form of jealousy, if that makes sense. So
Right.
for you, what are some of the things that you would want communities in the future, people that you or the city that you grew up in, what kind of future do you want them to have that you maybe didn't have growing up?
Yeah, I can list a million things if I had all day long, but I think the first thing that comes to mind with the recent decision to increase um, fares in New York City, I would say access to accessible transportation. Um, when I was growing up, at least, it was very accessible, but because the mayor feels like people are hopping turnstiles, he wants to increase fares and also put in like surveillance measures to further police the poor. So I would say access to accessible transportation, access to equitable education. I cannot really relate to this question because I've been very fortunate and privileged to have access to private school education and things like that. But I would say for future generations, like across the board, everyone should be able to go to a good school with good teachers and good resources. And teachers should get equitable pay as well. So those are two things that come to mind right now.
Well, I'll tell you what, you are someone who I'm glad to have met because you are someone who wants to constantly inspire people. I mean, I relate to you in this in the sense that, even though you do poetry and I do podcasting, we can be very hard on ourselves, but even with mistakes, we can always find ways to grow. And it really is about the journey and not the destination, because, we are all going through different obstacles, and yes, there are going to be people that will not understand what we're going through, but those who understand that we're doing things for good. I mean, it's not about me versus you, it's me and you versus a bigger problem, whatever
Right.
that problem may be. So, Fatima, thank you so much for joining the podcast. Thank you so much for being able to share your story, your journey, and I hope that you do amazing things with your poetry, activism, and hopefully in public office, whatever position that may be.
Thank you so much for having me. And I'm super excited to see like all the amazing things you're going to do in the future with your podcast and your computer science work.
Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode. If you guys like what you saw, be sure to subscribe to this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also follow us on Instagram at the OMCG Podcast for more information on guests, preview clips, and more. Please continue to support this podcast in the future, and I can't wait to see you guys in the next episode.